The tracks did not belong to anything living. Harlan Foss understood this the moment he crouched beside them in the gray morning light and looked at them with the full attention of a man who had spent 20 years reading ground for a living. He had followed deer sign through river canes so thick you could not push a hand through it. He had tracked elk across shale ridges where the stone held nothing but the faintest disturbance of lichen. He knew what an animal's passage looked like, what a man's looked like, and he knew the difference between a track made that morning and a track made 3 days ago. These tracks were old. The snow around them was undisturbed. Fresh snow had fallen twice in the past 4 days, and both falls had smoothed the forest floor into an unmarked white sheet that held every new impression with the clean precision of wax. But the tracks had not been made in fresh snow. They pressed through it into the older, harder pack beneath, the iron-gray crust that had been there since the first snowfall of October, when the cold came down out of the north 2 weeks before it should have, and locked the ground before any man in the territory was ready for it. To be that deep, those tracks had to have been made in October, before the second snow, before the third. But the snow around them was clean, undisturbed. Nothing had walked into those tracks since they were made, and nothing had walked away from them. They simply began and ended in open ground. Harlan stood up slowly and looked out into the timber. The trees were still. The light was the flat, directionless white of an overcast winter morning. Nothing moved. Not a branch, not a bird, not the distant sound of wind that had followed him all morning through the high ridges. The world had gone as quiet as a room after a door is closed. He stood there for a while longer than he needed to, turning the problem over with the same unhurried care he applied to anything that did not make immediate sense, and then he picked up his pack and continued north. He did not run through alternatives the way a less experienced man might. He had seen enough strange things in 2 decades of backcountry travel to know that alternatives at this distance from resolution were mostly a comfort sought rather than a truth pursued. Whatever he had seen in that clearing would either explain itself in time or it would not. In the meantime, there was ground to cover and daylight to use, and a cold that, even at midday, carried in it the promise of something harder to come. He walked north and said nothing about the tracks to the empty timber, and thought about them only when he did not intend to. The winter of 1845 entered the Ozark highlands early, and without the usual courtesies. Most winters gave you a warning. The first cold came and retreated, a tentative advance and withdrawal that allowed men and animals alike to prepare, to lay in the last of the wood, to bank the root cellars, to bring the vulnerable animals in from the far pastures. The cold of 1845 did not negotiate. It arrived in the 3rd week of October as a single, unbroken event, moving down from the northwest in the company of cloud cover that settled over the highland country like a lid and did not lift. By the second day, the temperature had dropped to what experienced men in the territory associated with January. By the end of the first week, the creek drainages were freezing at the margins. By the end of the second week, it was understood, without any particular announcement, that this was not a passing condition. This was the winter, arrived early, and it would not be argued with. Harlan Foss was 46 years old that autumn, a trapper and sometime scout who had worked the Missouri and Arkansas highland country since his middle 20s. He knew the territory the way a man knows the rooms of a house he has lived in for decades, not with the deliberate knowledge of study, but with the automatic and embedded knowledge of long familiarity. He knew which creek bottoms held beaver into late season, and which had been trapped out by the early 30s. He knew the old Osage trails through the high ridges, and the places where the limestone undercut the hillsides into shallow caves that served well enough for a night's shelter in hard weather. He knew the scattered settlements, the farmsteads and small communities that had taken root in the hollows and along the creek drainages over the past 2 decades, and he knew the people in them, at least by reputation, if not always by face. He had set out from a community near the White River in the 3rd week of October, intending a circuit north through the highland country and back by the 1st of December. It was a route he had made before, a series of trap lines and supply caches strung through 60 miles of back country, with perhaps 4 or 5 days of travel between the widely spaced homesteads, where he might expect a meal and a dry place to sleep. He had made this particular circuit 3 times in recent years. He knew the ground, the key landmarks, the personalities of the families along the way. He had no reason to expect it to be remarkable. The snow came on his 2nd day out, which was a day and a half earlier than he had anticipated, and the cold behind it came faster than any cold he had experienced in the highlands in 20 years. He adapted. He adjusted his pace, shortened his intended distances for each day, changed his route in 2 places to favor lower ground and better shelter. He stopped at the first farmstead he reached, a family named Pruitt, 3 days north of the river, running cattle on a long bench of ground above a creek drainage, and spent 2 nights there, watching the weather with the objective attention of someone who depends on weather for his continued presence among the living. The weather did not break. What had appeared to be a temporary hard spell revealed itself over those 2 days as something more fundamental. The sky gave no indication of change. The temperature did not moderate even at midday. The snow that had fallen in the first days lay exactly as it had fallen, neither settling nor shifting, and when a second snowfall came on his 2nd night at the Pruitt place, it added a distinct layer above the first, rather than blending with it, the way snows blend in normal conditions of temperature change. These were 2 separate events, separately preserved. He noticed this. He filed it away without conclusion and continued north. He had been walking for 3 days out of the Pruitt place when he came to the tracks in the clearing. He had crossed the ridge into timber he knew, old-growth timber on the east slope of a high ridge where the canopy was dense enough that the snow on the ground was thinner than in the open, compressed by the weight of what had collected in the branches above and fallen in irregular patches. This was familiar ground. He had walked this stretch a dozen times and knew its character, the way the ridge ran, the places where the rock broke through the surface, the small clearing halfway down the east slope, where a tree had come down some years earlier and opened a break in the canopy. He came to the clearing and stopped at its edge, not because anything had alarmed him, but because something had caught the edge of his attention in the way that things sometimes did in back country, a peripheral awareness that resolved, when he gave it direct attention, into the tracks. They began near the north edge of the clearing, emerging from the timber there, not hesitantly, not in the stumbling pattern of someone who has lost their footing, but with the regular, purposeful stride of a person who knows where they are going. They crossed the clearing at a slight diagonal, heading toward the open center, and they stopped there. In the middle of the open ground, on a patch of hard-packed snow that the winter sun, on its low November arc, reached for perhaps 2 hours of the day. He walked to them and crouched beside them. He looked at them for a long time without touching the snow. The depth of the impressions told him most of what he needed to know. They pressed through the fresh surface snow, both layers of it, the original October fall and the more recent one, into the old crust beneath. To make an impression that deep you had to be standing in snow at a time when the crust was still soft enough to take your weight, but cold enough to hold the impression once you had lifted your foot. That window was a few days at the beginning of the freeze, in October, before the cold had fully hardened the old crust to something closer to ice. He had been reading snow long enough to know the window with reasonable precision. These tracks were 6 weeks old. He stood up and looked at the clearing around them. He circled it once in a tight arc near the tracks themselves, then again in a wider arc that brought him close to the timber on all 4 sides. He moved methodically, the way he moved when he was tracking and had lost the sign and needed to find it again, looking not for the obvious but for the subtle, the faint disturbance of surface, the compression that a heel or a toe leaves in firm snow that the wind has not yet erased. He found nothing. The clearing held the tracks of the man who had walked into it in October and stopped, and nothing else. No departure, no continuation, no indication anywhere in the 3,000 square feet of open ground that the man had gone any direction at all after the moment he stopped moving. Harlan stood in the center of the clearing and looked at the tracks and felt, for the first time that winter, a quality of unease that was different in character from the ordinary vigilance of a man alone in back country. That ordinary vigilance was alert and forward-facing, concerned with the next hazard, the next decision. This was different. This looked backward. This was the specific unease of a man who has encountered something that does not fit into any framework he possesses for understanding the world, and who is therefore unable to identify what, precisely, he should be worried about. He was not afraid. He would say this clearly later, when he spoke of it. He was not afraid in the way of a man who senses immediate physical danger. He was unsettled in a way that did not resolve into any useful action, because the thing that unsettled him, a pair of tracks in snow that led nowhere and had no exit, did not correspond to any known threat he could address or avoid. He picked up his pack and continued north. The day he spent traveling away from the clearing was a long one, not in distance, but in the quality of the hours. The timber closed back in above him on the north side of the ridge, and the light went flat and uniform. The cold was absolute. His own breath fogged in front of him, and the moisture froze on the wool of his collar within minutes of each rest stop. He heard nothing, not wind, not bird, not the creak and pop of trees that sometimes accompanies extreme cold. The highland country had gone very quiet, in the specific way of a landscape that has been stopped. He made camp that night in a limestone overhang he knew on the south slope of the next ridge north, a shallow cave formed where the stone had sheared away from the hillside and left a protected shelf perhaps 8 feet deep and 12 feet wide. He had used it before. It faced south, and the slope below it caught whatever sun the winter days offered, and a fire against the back wall kept the space warm enough for sleep. He built his fire and ate what he had and sat with his back against the stone and thought about the tracks with the same methodical care he had applied to them in the clearing. He was a man who believed, generally, in the sufficiency of observable fact, who trusted that a thing either had an explanation or did not, and that in the case of the former, the explanation would eventually present itself, and in the case of the latter, the thing would simply remain unexplained, and neither outcome required him to form a conclusion before the evidence supported one. The tracks, in this framework, remained unexplained. He had no explanation to offer. He had not seen sign of any other person in that part of the timber. No camp, no evidence of recent travel, nothing that would suggest a man had been moving through the area in October. The farm country was well south. There were no settlements north of the Pruitt place until you reached the hollows. Another 2 days' travel, and the hollows were not places people left casually in the beginning of winter. He tried the explanation of wind and snow movement, that tracks made earlier might have been obscured or transposed by drifting, giving the impression of an impossible ending. He tried this explanation and found it insufficient. He had looked too carefully. The clearing had not been disturbed by drifting. The preservation of the tracks themselves argued against disturbance. Wind-shifted snow erased impressions. It did not preserve them in the state of their original making. He set the problem aside, the way he set aside all problems that could not be moved toward resolution, and he went to sleep. He slept poorly, not from cold and not from fear, but from the particular restlessness of a mind that has been given something it cannot put down. In the morning, he continued north. The second anomaly appeared 2 days later. On the approach to a small farmstead he had visited several times in previous years. The property belonged to a man named Alderman, a quiet, deliberate man of about 35, who had homesteaded a bench of good ground above a creek drainage perhaps 8 years earlier, and had built a clean and solid operation on it. The kind of place that showed in every detail the hand of someone who worked with intention, rather than improvisation. His wife was the same quality of person, careful, self-sufficient, not unfriendly, but not in need of company. He had stayed a night at the Alderman place on his last 2 circuits. They had fed him, and he had paid them in trade goods, and they had all sat companionably by the fire for an hour before sleeping. It was one of the better overnight stops on his route, and he had been looking forward to it in the uncomplicated way that a man in back country looks forward to a dry bed and a hot meal. He came around the last bend in the approach trail in the middle afternoon and stopped. The farmstead was there, the house, the small barn, the woodshed, the outhouse, all present, sitting under their heavy mantles of snow with the settled permanence of structures that had been in their places for years. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and straight in the windless air. The scene had every quality of an ordinary winter farm at rest, except the yard. He stood at the edge of it and looked. The yard between the house and the barn, perhaps 50 feet of open ground that on a normal winter farm would show the worn paths of daily use, the simple back and forth of morning chores and evening chores and the necessary movements between buildings, was covered, completely and densely, with tracks. Not the simple patterns of utility, not the economy of movement that governs the life of a working farm. These tracks were numberless and overlapping, pressed deep into the snow in a density that would require days of continuous movement to produce. The tracks of 2 people, he could distinguish that much, one set larger and one set smaller, moving in patterns that served no function he could identify. They went in loops, long, gradual arcs that covered the width of the yard and that turned back and covered it again. They went in straight lines from one building to another, and then back without entering either. They went in, overlapping circles near the center of the yard. In some places, the density of impressions was such that the snow had been packed nearly flat by the accumulation of passage. And all of it was old. The fresh snow that had fallen most recently lay on top of the tracks without filling them. They were pressed too deeply into the underlying crust to be erased by the shallow new fall. They had been made early, at the beginning of the freeze, and they had been made over a period, he estimated, from the layering and compression of many days. He stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the tracks for a long time, and then he went to the door and knocked. Alderman answered immediately, as though he had been near the door. He looked at Harlan with the same steady, self-contained expression Harlan remembered, and stepped back to let him in without ceremony. The interior of the house was warm and orderly, everything in its place, a pot on the fire, tools hung neatly on their hooks, the lamp lit against the early dark, the wife at the far end of the room, rising from her chair at the table to acknowledge the visitor. They ate together. The meal was good and ample, and consumed mostly in silence. That was the ordinary silence of people who live alone and have learned to find conversation either unnecessary or effortful. Harlan did not ask about the tracks. It was not his place, and beyond that, he found he did not know how to ask about them, could not frame the question in a way that did not impose on the asking more alarm than he was certain was warranted. He slept in the barn, and in the morning, over a brief breakfast, he said his thanks and took his leave. He had reached the far side of the small pasture east of the farmstead when some instinct made him stop and turn back. Alderman was standing at the edge of his yard, still and watchful, in the early morning cold. He was looking at the trail, not at Harlan, at the trail, at the stretch of snow between his yard and the place where Harlan now stood. At the tracks Harlan had left in the fresh surface. He was looking at them with an expression that Harlan, at the distance of 40 or 50 feet, could not read with precision, but that he would think about for a long time afterward. It was the expression of a man seeing something confirmed, not surprised, not alarmed, confirmed, as though the tracks in the snow were the answer to a question he had been carrying, and the answer was the one he had expected. He looked at Harlan's tracks with recognition. Harlan turned and walked on. He reached Cedar Hollow 4 days after leaving the Alderman place. He had been slowed by the snow on the high ridges, where the drifts had built in the west-facing gaps to depths that required careful navigation. On one of the crossings, he had gone up to his thighs in a drift that had looked solid and was not, and he had spent 20 minutes working himself free with the patience of a man who knows that urgency in that situation is the difference between inconvenience and death. He arrived in the hollow later than he had intended, tired in a way that the cold seemed to compound, his legs carrying the specific exhaustion of sustained effort in deep snow. Cedar Hollow was a settlement he had known for a dozen years, 6 or 7 families, close to 30 people, clustered in a hollow where 2 small creeks came together, and the ground leveled into a natural bench suited for the kind of tight-knit agricultural community that the back-country hollows seemed to generate from time to time. He had good relations with most of the families there, trading relations that had developed over years into something approaching friendship, and he had a supply cache in the settlement's small communal structure that he had placed in August and needed to retrieve. He came down the last slope into the hollow in the late afternoon of his 11th day out. The hollow was quiet in a way that stopped him at the edge of it, not the quiet of people inside their homes on a cold evening. A different quiet, a suspended quiet, as though the settlement had drawn in on itself and was holding something still. There was smoke from the chimneys. There were the ordinary visual signs of occupation, but no one was in the open. No children, no animals, no person on any visible errand. The hollow had the quality of a place that was waiting. He went to the cabin of a man named Cutter, who was his primary contact in the settlement, a reliable and unsentimental man of 50, who had been in the hollow since the early 30s, and who Harlan had come to regard as the most trustworthy source in the community on any matter of practical fact. Cutter opened the door before Harlan had reached the porch, having heard his approach on the hard snow, and pulled him inside with a directness that went slightly beyond the ordinary urgency of cold weather. They sat at the table. Cutter's wife, Mabel, brought coffee and took a seat herself, which told Harlan that whatever was to be discussed was not a thing the man intended to keep from his wife. Cutter sat for a moment before he spoke. He was the kind of man who prepared his words before offering them, who did not speak carelessly, and the pause was familiar to Harlan as a sign that what came next would be said exactly as intended. He said that the hollow had not been itself since the snow began. He did not mean the cold or the hardship of an early and severe winter. He meant something specific. He laid it out in order, with the methodical precision of a man describing symptoms to a doctor, not editorializing, not seeking a reaction, only conveying what he had observed and leaving the interpretation where it belonged, which was open. He said the snow in the hollow did not behave as snow behaved elsewhere. He described his 2 trips out of the hollow since October, once to a farmstead 2 ridges east, once to a settlement 4 miles south. In both those places, the winter had been ordinary winter. Snow fell and drifted, and in the limited warmth of the midday sun showed some small evidence of softening at the south-facing edges. Normal winter snow, behaving as winter snow behaves. In the hollow, the snow was static. Harlan had heard the word applied to weather before, still unchanging, fixed, but Cutter used it in a more precise sense. The snow in the hollow had not moved since it fell. It had not drifted in wind. It had not settled under its own weight. It had not changed in depth or character by so much as a measurable amount in 4 weeks. He had marked the door frame in October with a notch at the snow's surface. The snow sat exactly at the notch still. Not higher, not lower, exactly. More than this, the snow in the hollow held impressions the way nothing Cutter had seen snow hold impressions before. He had noticed it first by accident, coming out of the barn one morning and stopping to look at the yard. He had expected to see the fresh tracks of the morning, his own, from the cabin to the barn, and his wife's from the cabin to the kitchen garden. He had expected to see last night's light snowfall smoothed over the older impressions, the way new snow smooths things. He saw all of it, not only the fresh tracks of the morning, all of it. The tracks from every day since October, from every person who had moved through the yard, layered one above another, and each perfectly legible, as distinct from each other, as if each had been made in fresh-laid wax and then fixed in place before the next layer was added. He took Harlan to the window. It took Harlan a moment to understand what he was looking at. The yard outside was covered in snow, as yards were covered in winter. Then his eyes found the organization in what he had first read as random disturbance, and the organization resolved into something that stopped his thinking entirely for a moment. Tracks. Weeks of tracks, overlaid and simultaneous. The fresh impressions from that morning. Cutter's path to the barn, his wife's shorter path to the woodpile, sitting in their shallow layer at the surface. And beneath them, visible through the snow as text is visible through translucent paper, the impressions of every previous day. Not blurred, not merged, not reduced by accumulation to a general undifferentiated compression. Distinct, each layer distinct. He could see the path from 2 weeks ago as clearly as the path from this morning, and the path from a month ago as clearly as the path from 2 weeks, and more than that. Cutter pointed to a set of tracks along the east fence line. Harlan looked. The stride was shorter than Cutter's, with a slight inward cant of 1 foot that was characteristic of a particular individual's walk. Cutter said those tracks had been in the October crust since the first snow. He had recognized them in the first week, when the quality of the snow's preservation had become clear enough to distinguish one person's impressions from another's. He had recognized them because he had spent 30 years watching that walk, the slightly shortened stride of a man past 60, the particular manner in which the left foot turned. His father, who had died in the hollow in the winter of 1839. Harlan stood at the window for a long time without speaking. Cutter said he was not a man given to interpretations that exceeded his evidence. He was telling Harlan what was visible in the snow. He was not telling him what it meant, because he did not know what it meant. He did not know if it meant anything that could be spoken of in ordinary terms. He said there was more. The more was this. objects that had been dropped or set down in the snow since October remained visible. The snow did not conceal them the way ordinary snow concealed things set in it. A tool dropped in the yard, a glove left on the porch railing, a piece of firewood that had rolled from the stack into the snow. All of these things remained visible through the snow that covered them, the way objects are sometimes visible through river ice that is clear enough to see through. Not on the surface, under the surface, covered, but not hidden. He took Harlan outside and pointed to a place near the corner of the barn where, 3 weeks earlier, he had set down an auger he had been using and then been called away to another task and had not remembered it until the snow of the following day had come. He had gone to look for it without real expectation of finding it quickly, and had stopped when he saw it clearly visible under 6 inches of new snow, lying exactly as he had set it down, its handle and bit perfectly legible through the pale translucent cover. Harlan looked at the spot. He crouched down and looked carefully at the surface of the snow, and then through it. The snow was not transparent in any ordinary sense. It was snow, white and opaque at a glance. But when he looked at it with concentration, with the attention he brought to reading ground in difficult conditions, he could discern, just at the threshold of visibility, the shape of the auger beneath the surface. A dark line, slightly blurred, slightly compressed by the snow above it, but present. He stood up. He thought about the tracks in the clearing on the east slope of the ridge, 4 days south. The man who had walked to the center of the clearing and stopped. The clean snow around the ending point, undisturbed by any departure. He thought about Alderman's yard, the loops and arcs, the days of purposeless movement pressed into the October crust. He thought about Alderman standing at the edge of his yard, watching Harlan's departing tracks with that expression of recognition. He thought, what does a man recognize in fresh tracks in the snow that makes him look as though he has had something confirmed? He did not say any of this to Cutter. He said, what else? Cutter said that the settlement had discussed, collectively and individually, what they were dealing with. They had not reached any useful conclusion. They were not people, most of them, given to explanations that required them to step very far outside the practical world. Several of them had suggested natural causes, unusual mineral content in the water table affecting the freeze, unusual characteristics of the hollow's specific topography, creating conditions that preserved snow differently than open country. These explanations had the appeal of practicality without the conviction of plausibility. He said 3 people had tried to leave the hollow since the first snow. The first had returned within hours. He would not speak about what he had seen. He had gone back to his family's cabin and, as of Cutter's last knowledge, had spent the 2 weeks since rarely emerging from it. His behavior was not alarming in the sense of violence or incoherence. He ate. He slept. He did not speak about his attempt to leave and would not be drawn on the subject. The second and third were a couple who had been planning to winter in another settlement and had set out with a loaded wagon on a clear morning in November. They had returned by nightfall, the wife in a state that Cutter described with careful precision as not frightened, but overwhelmed. The husband, who was a steady and undemonstrative man, said only that the road out of the hollow was different from the road into it. He had been brief and had not elaborated. He and his wife had stayed. Cutter himself had made both of his trips out without significant difficulty. He had gone and come back. But he said, and he said it in the same measured way he said everything else, that the return had a character to it, a distinction. Coming into the hollow from outside was not the same as going in the other direction. He was aware, on the return, of passing through something. Not a gate, not a physical threshold, a distinction in the quality of the air, the quality of the light, the quality of the sound of his own footsteps. A distinction that said, here is the inside, and behind you is the outside, and these are not continuous with each other in the way that places ordinarily are. He said he found this difficult to describe and was aware that it sounded imprecise. Harlan said he understood. He stayed 3 days. He walked the settlement each morning in the early light, slowly, without a stated purpose. He read the snow as he would have read any ground that carried information he had not yet organized into meaning. He was not sure, as he walked, what he was looking for, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that looking might not be the right framework, that whatever the hollow was showing him required a different orientation than looking, one he did not have a name for. He found the tracks of Cutter's father on his second morning, along the east fence line of the property exactly, where Cutter had shown him from the window. He crouched beside them in the early light and looked at them for a long time. They were old impressions, sunken through weeks of accumulated snowfall to the original October crust, and yet they were clear. The stride of an older man, shorter than a younger man's, with the careful, unhurried quality of someone who has made peace with his pace. Moving along the fence line in one direction, turning at the post, coming back. He recognized the movement, not the specific walk. He had never known the man, but the activity. Checking the fence, the morning rounds of a working farm, the verification of the boundaries of what you are responsible for. A man in his 60s, on a cold morning, making sure the fence was sound. Something in this ordinary evidence of an ordinary life, preserved complete and legible in the snow 6 years after the man had died, struck Harlan with a force he had not anticipated and could not entirely account for, crouched in the snow for longer than he had intended. And when he stood up, he was aware of a quality in his chest that was not grief. He had not known the man, and was not fear, and was not comfort, but was something in the range of all three that he did not have a word for. He thought about what the hollow was doing. He thought, carefully, without settling into conclusion, about the possibility that this was not a malfunction of the natural world, that the preservation was not a failure of the snow to behave correctly, but the snow behaving with a different logic than the one he ordinarily attributed to it. That the snow was doing what it always did, which was to hold the impressions of what passed through it, and that the only thing unusual was the conditions, here in this hollow, in this particular winter, that made what was always true suddenly visible. He did not know what to do with this thought. It was too large for practical application. A man could not act on the knowledge that the snow preserved everything, any more than he could act on the knowledge of his own mortality. He could only hold it and go on. He walked the settlement and let the evidence accumulate in him, without demanding that it arrange itself into sense. On his first full day, he walked the perimeter of the hollow. He had an instinct, which he did not explain to anyone, to understand the shape of the thing before he tried to understand its substance. A hollow was a defined space, bounded by ridgelines, open at the drainage end where the creeks ran out, closed on 3 sides by the hills. He wanted to walk the boundaries and see if the distinction Cutter had described, the quality of an edge, a perceptible inside and outside, was something he could locate physically. He walked south along the creek, out the drainage end, until he felt it. It was subtle. He would have missed it if he had not been looking for it, and even looking for it, he was not entirely certain he had found it rather than invented it. But somewhere in the stretch of timber, south of the last cabin, at a point he could not have marked precisely, the quality of his attention changed. The sound of his footsteps was different. The cold was the same, The snow was the same. The trees were the same trees. But there was a distinction, faint and definitive in the way of the line between one field and another, between country you know and country you are entering for the first time. He stood in it for a moment and then walked back north into the hollow. The distinction reversed as he crossed it. Coming in was different from going out. He did not test the east or west boundaries, because the ridgelines there were steep enough that he would not have been able to walk them without purpose, and he was not prepared to explain his purpose. He went back to the settlement and walked the yards and the communal ground and read the snow. He found on his walk through the interior something he had not expected, and that Cutter had not mentioned, or had not known to mention because it required sustained reading to see. The tracks in the snow were not only of the living. He had understood, from Cutter's account, that the snow preserved old impressions alongside new ones, the passage of people who had moved through the hollow in previous seasons, previous years, made visible by the same conditions that preserved the current winter's tracks. He had expected this. What he had not anticipated was the depth of it, the degree of it. He stood at the edge of the communal ground, the open space between the main cluster of cabins where the settlement gathered for tasks and events that required shared space, and he read the snow with the full attention he had brought to the clearing on the ridge, south of here, where a man had walked to the center and stopped. The communal ground held more tracks than could have been made in any single winter. He could not count the layers. He could distinguish the recent ones, the current residents, their daily movements, the familiar paths between known points, and he could distinguish below them older impressions, degraded but legible, of people whose stride he did not recognize. Smaller impressions than the current residents. Children, he thought, though the settlement had few children at present, and he knew most of them by sight and gait. Impressions of different boots than he saw on the current residents' feet. The particular deep impression of a man who had been heavy, or had carried heavy loads, pressed into the oldest layer, barely visible, but there. The hollow went back 30 years in its snow. He stood in the communal space and looked down at 30 years of a community's movement, preserved and layered and simultaneous, and he felt the full weight of what the place was holding. He thought about all the people who had come to this hollow and made their lives in it and moved on or died, or simply ceased to appear in the record of the snow. The families who had left in the early years when the settlement was new and uncertain. The people who had died in hard winters, or from the ordinary causes that killed people in back-country settlements. Accident, illness, the cumulative weight of hard work in a hard land. They had all walked this ground. They had all left their impressions in some snow of some winter, and those impressions had been preserved, layer by layer, winter by winter, in the ground of the hollow that never quite released them. He understood, standing there, what the young man on the road south had seen and why he had turned around. He turned around himself and went back to Cutter's cabin. On his second evening, sitting by Cutter's fire, he raised the question of the man who had tried to leave and returned silent. He asked if anyone had gone to speak with him. Cutter said yes. His wife had gone, and the boy's mother, and the circuit preacher who had been in the hollow when the snow began and who was still in the hollow now, unable to continue his route. The boy, he was 19, not truly a boy, would say only one thing. He said that on the road south, a half-day out of the hollow, the road had passed through a stretch of old timber that he knew well, that he had traveled many times. And in that stretch of old timber, the snow on either side of the road had held, in the layers he could now read as clearly as text, the impressions of everyone who had ever traveled that road, not just in this winter. Old impressions, impressions that were deeper and more degraded than those in the hollow, but still legible, as a very old letter is still legible, even when the paper is brown and the ink is faded. He had stopped his horse and looked at the snow on either side, and he had read, in the accumulated impressions of years of passage, something that he could not describe in words. He had turned his horse around. He would not say what he had read. Cutter relayed this account to Harlan, and then was silent for a moment. He said, "I think there are things preserved in that snow, that a person should not see all at once." He said it without drama, as a practical observation. Harlan thought about this for the rest of the evening, and slept poorly that night, and lay in the dark of the barn, listening to the horses breathe and thinking about the young man on the road south, and what he might have read in old timber on either side of a familiar road, and deciding that he did not need to test whether he would find the same thing, and would travel a different route when he left. He spent his third morning doing something that had no practical justification, which was unusual for him. He stood at the place near the east fence line, where Cutter's father's tracks ran along the boards, and he read them with the full attention he was trained, by years of tracking, to bring to a trail he was trying to follow. Then he followed them. Not far, the tracks ran along the fence for perhaps 60 feet, turned at the post, and came back. An ordinary morning task, made in some ordinary morning 6 years before, in the life of a man who had worked this land and cared for it and left it, in the way all men leave things, not by choice. He walked beside the tracks for their full length. He turned when they turned. He came back when they came back. He stood still afterward for a moment. He did not know why he had done it. He could not have explained it if asked. It was not sentiment. He had not known the man. It was something that had to do with the particular quality of the preserved impression, the evidence of an ordinary life in ordinary motion, and the question of what it meant to stand beside that evidence 6 years after the man who made it had ceased to exist. He thought about his own tracks, the ones he had been leaving in the hollow's snow for 3 days. He thought about the hollow's preservation, the depth of it, the way it held impressions from decades back. He thought about the fact that his tracks, when he left, would not leave with him. They would stay. They would be held in the layers of the hollow's snow, legible to anyone who came here with the capacity to read them, for as long as the hollow preserved what passed through it. He found he did not know how to feel about this. He stood with it for a while, and then walked back to the settlement. He left on the 4th morning. He said his goodbyes to Cutter and his wife, and to the other families who came out of their cabins to mark his departure with the usual words and handshakes. The settlement had the quality, he noticed again, of people in a state of sustained attention, not afraid but alert, the alertness of people who have been changed by something, and are still taking the measure of the change. The young man came to the door of his parents' cabin and stood in the threshold. He looked at Harlan without particular expression. Harlan raised a hand. The young man looked at him for a moment, and then his gaze dropped to the snow in the yard, to the tracks Harlan had made on his way to the door, and the look that came over his face then was one Harlan recognized. It was the same look Alderman had worn, standing at the edge of his yard. Recognition, confirmation, the look of a man seeing something that told him what he already knew. Harlan turned away from it and walked out of the hollow by the east trail, which he had determined was the better route, and he felt the distinction Cutter had described, the edge of the hollow, the place where the inside became the outside, and he passed through it and did not look back. On the other side, in ordinary winter, in ordinary snow, he walked south toward the river and home. On the other side, in ordinary winter, in ordinary snow, he walked south toward the river and home. He traveled the return route with more attention to the ground than the outward journey. The hollow had changed his relationship to snow in a way he was still taking the measure of. He looked at it differently now. The snow that he had moved through for 20 years as simply a surface condition was now a thing with interior qualities he could not unknow. He crouched once in an open meadow 2 days south of the hollow and looked at the snow with concentrated attention, trying to see if any trace of previous impression was legible in ordinary cold. He saw nothing. The meadow was ordinary snow, compressed and wind-shifted and uninformative. He felt something he recognized as relief and something he recognized as disappointment in equal parts. He passed by the alderman place at some distance, taking a route through the timber that avoided the farmyard. He had not decided consciously to avoid it. He found, when he was past it, that he had not wanted to stand at the edge of that yard and read what was preserved in the old crust. He did not think he was ready. He passed above the clearing on the east ridge where he had found the tracks in October. He did not go down to it. He reached the river settlement in the second week of November. His wife, a steady and perceptive woman who had learned to read him over the years, asked him that evening what had happened in the high country. He said the winter had been severe and the routes difficult. She said that was not what she was asking. He told her some of it. Not all. He told her about the hollow and the tracks and the quality of the snow's preservation. He told her about Cutter's father's footprints along the fence line. He told her about the young man on the road south who had seen something and turned back. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "Do you think it is only that hollow?" He was quiet for a long time. He said, "No, I don't think it is only that hollow." He mentioned none of this to others. He noted the severity of the winter and the difficult routes and let it rest there. He traded his furs and resupplied and let the winter deepen around him in the low country, where the cold was still hard, but the snow behaved as snow was supposed to behave, falling, drifting, melting in degrees, revealing the ground it covered when the season finally turned. He went back to the highland country in late April, when the roads had dried enough to travel. He was not certain what to expect. He had not permitted himself to form expectations in either direction, had not allowed himself to hope for any resolution or dread any continuation. He would go and he would see what he found, and that would be the extent of it. The thaw had come to the lower country by early April, and to the highland foothills by mid-April, and when he rode north, he rode through the familiar process of spring, the snowmelt retreating up the slopes, the brown ground reappearing in patches, the creek levels swelling, the air carrying the cold mineral smell of water freed from ice. Normal, the world recovering its ordinary character after the winter's long assertion. He came to Cedar Hollow in the last week of April. The hollow was open. The snow was gone. The ground was spring mud and early grass, and the first pale green shoots of things returning to life. And the settlement sat in it, looking like any settlement in early spring, slightly battered, as they all were, slightly compressed by the long confinement of a hard winter, but intact and beginning to open. He stood at the edge of the hollow and looked down into it. The yard outside Cutter's cabin was bare ground. The tracks were gone. He had not known, until this moment of their absence, how fully he had been carrying the expectation of their continuation. He stood and looked at the bare mud of the yard and felt something settle in him that had been held up and waiting. He found Cutter in the barn, and they shook hands in the way of men who have been through something together, which in a sense they had, though they had been through it in different places and different degrees. The winter had ended, Cutter said. In the last week of March, the cold had broken in a single day, the way it sometimes does when winter loses its hold all at once rather than by degrees. and the snow had begun to go. It had gone quickly, more quickly than Cutter had expected, given its apparent permanence, though perhaps he had been wrong to expect permanence simply because it had been unchanged for so long. Within a week the hollow was clear. The tracks went with the snow. Every impression, every layered record, every evidence of every person who had moved through the hollow since October, gone with the melt, as though the snow had been the only medium in which any of it existed, and once the medium was gone, the record was gone with it. He asked about the preserved objects, the auger, the kitchen knife he had heard described, the other things that had remained visible through the snow's surface. The auger was there, lying where he had set it, freed by the melt. Undamaged, the other objects, the things that had been dropped and lost in previous winters and preserved in the snow's deeper layers, were not there. The melt had revealed the ground, and the ground held only what had been set down in recent memory. The older things, the things that had no business being preserved through years of ordinary winters, were not in the mud where the snow had been. They had gone with the snow. Or, and Cutter did not say this, but Harlan thought it, turning the logic over, they had always been only in the snow. They had never been in the ground. The snow had not revealed them because they were there, and the snow had cleared away to show them. The snow had been the medium of their existence. When the medium dissolved, so did they. He thought about what this meant, and then he stopped thinking about it, because it was a direction of thought that led somewhere he was not prepared to go. He asked about the people. All present, Cutter said. Everyone who had been in the hollow in October was still in the hollow in April. No one had left during the winter, except the 2 trips Cutter himself had made. No deaths, no serious illnesses beyond the ordinary complaints of a confined winter. The young man who had fallen silent after his failed departure had come back to himself in February, emerging from the habit of silence gradually, the way a person emerges from a long illness, slowly, with some residual fragility, but returning. The couple who had tried to leave were still in the hollow, and were speaking, Cutter said, of trying again in June, when the roads would be at their best. He asked about the circuit preacher who had been stranded. The preacher had left in early April, as soon as the roads were passable. He had been in the hollow for 5 months. He had said very little about the experience, which was itself notable in a man whose vocation required him to offer meaning for difficult things. He had conducted services throughout the winter with his ordinary dedication, and had said nothing in those services, as far as Cutter knew, that directly addressed what the hollow had been holding in its snow. On his last night before leaving, he had said one thing to Cutter that Cutter had remembered. He had said that he was not sure anymore that the past was where we put it. He had said this quietly and without the rhetorical structure of a man making a point. He had said it in the way of a man reporting an observation. Cutter relayed this without comment. Harlan nodded. He stayed 2 nights in the hollow, then continued his circuit. On his second morning before leaving, he walked to the east fence line one more time. There was no snow there now. The fence line sat in spring mud and new grass, ordinary and unremarkable, the boards and posts simply themselves without any overlay of record or time. He looked at the ground where the tracks had been. It held nothing. The earth was indifferent. He stood there for a moment. He thought about Cutter's written note, the one his widow had shared. I do not think the hollow was different from other places. He thought about it with the full weight of a year's consideration, and he thought it was probably true. He thought the hollow had been an accident of conditions, the particular cold, the particular stillness, the particular topography, that had created a window into something always present and always invisible, a window that had opened for one winter and then closed, as windows did. He thought, somewhere else, in some other winter, the conditions will be right again. He thought, they are probably right somewhere now, in some hollow or clearing or stretch of open ground, and no one is watching with the right attention. He picked up his pack. The rest of the route was ordinary. The high country was wet and cold, but navigable, and the settlements he passed through were recovering from the hard winter in the usual ways, and the people he spoke with described the usual hardships, and none of them described anything like what he had seen and heard in the hollow. He completed his circuit and returned to the river settlement in late May. He did not speak of it in any sustained way until he was an old man. He lived until 1869, working the highland country into his mid-50s, and then settling at the river with a modest property and a late marriage to a widow with 2 grown children. His nephew, who had grown up in the same community, spent time with him in the last years of his life, and heard the account of the winter of 1845 on several occasions, told in the same careful, unhurried way that characterized everything Harlan said about the back country. The nephew put it down in writing in 1871, 2 years after Harlan's death. He was 34 years old at the time and had lived in the Missouri highlands all his life and was a man, by his own description, of practical disposition. He verified what he could. The winter of 1845 was a matter of shared memory in the highland communities. Its severity, its early arrival, the anomalous character of the snow in the higher elevations, where people spoke of it as something set apart from ordinary winters in ways they were not always able to articulate clearly, but returned to consistently, the way people return to a thing they have not finished thinking about. He found Cutter's widow, who remembered the winter and the snow and confirmed the general character of what her husband had described to Harlan without the specific details, which she said she had not known in their entirety until after Cutter died and she read the notes he had made. He had kept notes. He had written down what the snow held and what it did not hold and what had happened to the people who tried to leave. He had written it, as plainly as he did everything else, in a small notebook that his wife had not read, while he was alive because she had not known he was writing, and he had not offered the information. He had written at the end of his notes, on the last page, a single sentence that he had not elaborated upon. He wrote, "I do not think the hollow was different from other places. I think other places have the same capacity and have only not yet found the conditions to show it." The nephew ended his account with a reflection of his own, offered not as conclusion, but as the residue of all he had heard and verified and thought about in the months of compiling the account. He wrote that he could not walk in snow any more without an awareness of it that he had not possessed before. Not fear, not reverence exactly, an awareness. The knowledge, which he could not unlearn, which Harlan had given him without intending to, and which had not diminished with time, that the snow beneath his feet was not simply weather, that it was a medium with a capacity for retention, that ordinary, conditions kept invisible, that in the right cold, in the right winter, what it held could become legible. He thought about what it held in every winter he had lived through, what it held now in the winter he was writing this, outside the window, where the snow lay over the ground of a community that had existed for 30 years and where 30 years of ordinary passage pressed through ordinary winters lay invisible in the ground, preserved perhaps in some layer that normal temperatures kept sealed, that normal springs dissolved before anything could be seen. He was not frightened by this thought. He was not comforted by it either. He was, he wrote, simply aware of it, the way you become aware of the depth of the water when you are standing in a river, and the awareness does not change what the water is. and does not change what you do, but it changes the quality of being in the river forever after. He ended his account there. Some things, once understood, cannot be set aside. The snow does not forget. It holds what moves through it, and it holds it whole, and the only question, in any winter, in any place, is whether the conditions will ever be cold enough, and still enough and deep enough to let the living see what the snow has been keeping. In Cedar Hollow, in the winter of 1845, they were. It has not been reported since. Whether that means it has not happened, or only that no one who witnessed it wrote it down, is a question the record cannot answer. The snow keeps its own account.